perfect marriage. Yes, that's what I had. Or at least as far as I could tell, that was indeed the case. My wife Hilly and I tied the proverbial knot almost 20 years ago. In fact, I turned 20 years old in a few weeks, on December 10th, and I could honestly say that there wasn't much I could change to make our life together even better. We, of course, quarreled, but making up was always much more pleasant. That's just who we were. In our marriage, there was only one truly dark period, and that was in the second year. We both married young. I was 20, and Hilly was only 18, and we had been childhood sweethearts, living around the corner from each other. My older brother, Bob, had married her sister, Pam, the year before, and it seemed like the right decision. Our problem was that the other two had their first child within the first year, and we couldn't seem to. We got tested, both of us, even though the doctors told us we were worrying too much and should just let it happen. But the problem was Hilly's parents, or rather her mother, who kept telling us to start a family. Of course, their family was like that. And in addition to her sister Pam, Hilly had 3 other sisters. Jen, my mother-in-law, was desperate for a son, having been unable to give birth to one herself. And, of course, Bob and Pam's first child was another girl. Pressure. The test results turned out to be rather inconclusive. Hilly was fine, but for me, the amount of active material was a little low or something like that. I still didn't understand anything. The doctors assured us that it was nothing serious, that everything was fine, that we just needed to be patient, and that our first child would decide for himself when to come. We endured, but that didn't mean our marriage wasn't under strain. Luckily, as it turned out, we didn't have to wait too long, and in the 3rd year of our marriage, Hilly gave birth, just as the doctor promised. Linda is a beautiful baby in every way, but just one more girl. This at least put our fears to rest as to whether we would be able to have a child or not. And from then on, things calmed down and our marriage became perfect and continued that way. No doubt because we were more relaxed, Hilly soon became pregnant again and Tom was finally born. Yes, boy, and the whole family was in 7th heaven. Don't get the impression that girl children were ignored or loved less, but the first son in the family simply made everything special. Well, I did it first, I boasted to my older brother, but he just smiled back at me and told me to give him time. Well, he got it, and sure enough, the next year their first son was born, and I'd be damned if 8 months later we didn't have another one we named Mike. Just like on buses, isn't it? You wait forever, and then a whole bunch of them come at once. Probably because we were 2 brothers and 2 sisters, we all lived like one big happy family. Even when Hilly's other sisters got married, they were simply drawn there. It was great for the kids, and of course, none of us ever lacked a babysitter when we needed one. As far as I know, other couples were as happy as Hilly and I were, simply enjoying the wonders of a simple married life with a loving family nearby. There were a few other mishaps too, like when Bob had an accident at work and I had to be practically tethered next to him while he was slowly transfused with my blood. He dealt with it, and of course, I was no worse for it, often joking brotherly that now we were truly blood brothers. As our 20th anniversary approached, we were wondering how to celebrate. Bob and Pam had celebrated their anniversary the year before, and everyone had enjoyed getting together so much that we decided to do much the same and booked a private room at a local hotel for a large gathering of family and friends. By then, Linda was a very beautiful girl of 17, younger and perhaps even more beautiful than her mother, with luxurious dark brown hair and huge green eyes that attracted attention whenever she looked in your direction. They were built the same way, both slender, with beautiful legs and other advantages that perhaps the father should not focus too much on. Of course, she had a whole series of boyfriends, and one or another was constantly appearing in the house, but she had a reasonable head on her shoulders, so we just went with the flow. Tom, I always thought, was a little more like me, stronger build, and that suited him. He loved rugby as much as Bob and I did at his age, and at nearly 16 he was already playing regularly as a halfback for his school's first team. And young Mike, the youngest, well, He may have been going through a rough patch, and without being as good at sports as Tom, or for that matter as popular as Linda, poor Mike was having a rough time. Nothing serious. He was very smart, perhaps even smarter than the other two, and did very well in school. He just acted like a completely normal, completely incomprehensible teenager. On that day. Perhaps I should have been more understanding that day. Perhaps I should have ignored the mess he left on the dining room table. Maybe I should have just cleaned up after him. But did I remove it? No. You're not leaving until you clean up this mess, Mike, I told him firmly. I'll do it later, he replied gloomily. You do it now, Mike, I insisted. Why are you always picking on me? He shouted back, losing his composure. I'm not being picky, I told him sharply. You are a member of this family and will abide by our rules just like the rest. Who will force me? Mike almost cried, truly losing his composure. I am, I snapped, starting to lose patience. I am your father, and you will do what I say. Is that you, my father? He shouted back. Are you sure about this? I stopped suddenly, my next line still locked in my throat, shocked by what he had just said. Sorry, Dad. Mike jumped up, with a pained expression on his face. Sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to say that. I'll sort everything out right now. With these words, he turned away from me and rummaged around the table, collecting books and other things that he had left there. A few minutes later, the all was clear, and he stormed out of the room without another word, leaving me in my own world, wondering if this world was going to come crashing down on me. The problem, of course, was that Mike was and always was different from the other two. More trainable, more serious, but less outgoing than his older siblings. I often wondered why he was so different, and even discussed it with Hilly. But she just shrugged and said it was just my imagination. Is it so? Was I like this? What prompted Mike to make this remark? If he had just shouted it in anger and walked away, I would have been angry with him, but that would have been the end of it. But he apologized so quickly and retracted the remark. Why? What did he know that I didn't know? Oh shit, I really didn't want to think about the thoughts that were running through my restless brain at that moment. My first reaction was to rush out to find Hilly and demand to know what she had done. But what would this lead to? What would I say? I couldn't possibly just go and accuse her of having sex with some other guy behind my back. If that was the case, she would simply deny it. And if not, then how could she forgive me for doubting her? Besides, this was 16 years ago or more. But does this change anything? Is it really still going on? My stomach felt sick. I wanted to be sick, and I still didn't know if I had any reason to worry. Oh God, what a terrible day it was. Blood types. This is it, I thought. And without further ado, I went into our office and sorted out the children's medical records, Linda, Tom, and Mike. All O+, which, after donating blood to my brother, I knew was the same as mine. I felt a wave of relief wash over me until it occurred to me that blood types don't tell the whole story. If Mike had been different, then it would have been one thing. But the fact that they were all of the same group could have just been a coincidence and did not confirm that he was really my own son. Oh my God, what to do? Test DNA? I couldn't believe that such a thought had occurred to me, and that one careless comment from an angry son had thrown me off balance. I panicked for no good reason, but when that night at dinner, Mike couldn't see my eyes throughout the entire meal, I started to worry again. And when he jumped out from the table without saying a word to anyone, I got really worried. What happened to Mike? Hilly asked, also noticing his strange behavior. I have no idea, I replied, shrugging. Do you children have any ideas? They both shook their heads, probably not even noticing anything strange. Was he upset about something? I asked, but they just shook their heads. After waiting for the two teenagers to leave the table, I worked up the courage to question my wife a little. Mike is so different from the other two, Hilly, I began. Any ideas why this might be? Oh, let's not repeat this topic, Davy, she replied, standing up to put away the dishes. He's not that different. He's just a little deeper than the other two. End of conversation. Was this done intentionally, or was she genuinely indifferent to it? I really didn't know. Test DNA? Why not find out about it? And 20 minutes later, I was already Googling it on the internet. An hour later, my head was full of facts and figures, but to be honest, I wasn't much wiser. It wasn't until Monday morning that I found the name of the laboratory that performed the test. It took me almost an hour to find it, and no doubt my secretary would have done it much faster. But how do you explain to your secretary why you need him? Exactly. That's why I decided to do it myself. They could do it, they had no problems, but it was expensive, especially if you wanted results as quickly as I did. But I had to know before I risked my marriage. Was Mike my son or not? When I told them I had 3 children, they offered to send me samples of each of them to cross-check with one of my own. Have you ever tried to get even one hair from your adult children? Not easy, let me tell you. And with Mike continuing to avoid me at every opportunity, this was the hardest of all. However, I managed, sent them away, and waited. Now I just had to wait for information whether Mike was my son. Over the next week, Mike seemed to calm down again, perhaps relieved that I had not confronted him about his outburst. We almost got to the point where I felt like I could broach the subject gently, but I decided it was best to wait for the results, since I was going down that path. My wife, of course, continued to be her usual loving self, and nothing else seemed to change in our daily routine. I can't say that it was the most enthusiastic sex I've had these few days, but I didn't refuse it. Doubts gnawed at me inside, and although I tried my best to hide it from Hilly, I simply could not have sex with her without wondering who else could have done it in the 20 years of our marriage. One evening, I was having dinner with my brother and his wife, and when we were alone, I almost confessed my fears to him. He and I were very similar in almost every way, so if anyone else was Mike's father, then reason told me it couldn't be him. My God, why did I even think that? Have I really become that paranoid already? However, something stopped me. I didn't have to burden him with my doubts, and after all, I was confident that he would be there for me if the results turned out to be bad. I remained calm. He was silent. I was so quiet that Hilly asked me if I was okay a couple of times. I'm fine, he answered her. I just have a few things on my mind. She looked worried for a moment, but didn't question me. The results have arrived. I asked them to be delivered to my office in case Hilly arrived before me and opened the letter. I read it with trembling hands, trying to understand what it all meant. Did this piece of paper really mean the end of my marriage? I read it. As far as I could tell, Mike's results matched mine well, and I felt relaxed, even though I still didn't understand it all. You probably already guessed that medical terms are a complete mess for me. In fact, the entire report was full of good matches and close matches, so it seemed like the whole thing was a storm in a teacup. What a damn relief. I felt tears welling up in my eyes and thanked the heavens for not telling Hilly about my fears. I decided to make it up to her that evening, maybe invite her to dinner and then to... After rereading the cover letter, which I hadn't paid much attention to, I saw that the lab wanted me to call them and discuss the results. I guess it was just an excuse to make more money off of me, and I thought, should I bother? Hello, this is Davy Jones, I said when the phone answered. Dr. Hoskins asked me to call him. After giving the woman some recommendations and so on, I was eventually connected with the good doctor. Hello, Mr. Jones, he greeted me. Have you had the opportunity to familiarize yourself with the results that we sent you? Yes, I answered confidently. If I understand correctly, it seems that my fears about my son Mike were unfounded. Yes, but I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, he blurted out, and the floor seemed to disappear from under me as I waited for him to destroy my world. Are you saying that he is not my son? I muttered back to him. That's not the point, Mr. Jones, he continued. The odds that he is not your offspring are less than 1,000,000 to 1. I would bet my entire reputation on the fact that he is your own son. So Mike is my real son, I answered with relief. Yes, Mr. Jones. What's the problem then? I continued hesitantly. What else could be wrong? By that time, I was already very worried because I had read somewhere that DNA testing could detect genetic diseases and the like. Was Mike sick? Maybe one of us has something terrible? What was he going to tell me? These are the other 2 samples you sent. the doctor told me seriously. The ones your son's brother and sister have? Yes. What's wrong with them? I asked, starting to panic. Is there something wrong with one of them? Well, it appears they are only half-siblings of your youngest son, Mr. Jones. Half-brothers and sisters? I hissed at him. What does this mean, doctor? What are half-siblings? That means, Mr. Jones, he continued, that it is very unlikely that you are their real father. I dropped the phone, and the next thing I knew, I came with a group of my work colleagues around me. Give him some air, I heard someone call to me as I slowly came to my senses, fighting for my breath. Are you okay, Davy? Another voice asked, and I nodded my head, trying to get to my feet. They helped me, and I found myself sitting in my chair with people behind me, muttering about how hot it was in the office and how stressed they were all under due to the workload. What nonsense. If only they knew. They got someone to drive me home, telling me to take the day off. I was grateful that the house was empty when I arrived. Hilly was at her part-time job and the kids were at school. I had to do it. I really didn't want to do this, but I had to. With trembling fingers, I dialed the lab number again, and a few moments later, I was talking to the doctor again, apologizing for cutting off the call earlier. Sorry, Mr. Jones, he said. I should have warned you in advance, but we only work with mail, and this is sometimes very difficult. I told him I knew there was nothing wrong with me, and he went over the test results with me again. Mike was definitely mine. Linda and Tom were hardly my children. But the results say that all the matches were good or close, doctor, I pleaded. Could there be some kind of mistake? If we only had one sample, he explained carefully, we could very well ask for another sample for testing. But with two samples, it's almost 100% certain. These two are full brother and sister, but I'm afraid it's unlikely that you are their father. But you said they were close, I repeated, desperately clinging to a thin thread of hope. What does it mean? Do you have a twin, Mr. Jones? He asked cautiously. Or maybe brother. My brother, I exclaimed excitedly. What the hell does he have to do with it? You must draw your own conclusions, Mr. Jones, the doctor continued. If you could get your brother's sample, we could test it. But I didn't listen anymore. My little ideal world really ended abruptly. What to do about it? Did I want to end my marriage? Did I want to end my relationship with my only brother? You can cancel your wife, but you definitely can't cancel your brother. Maybe it's better to continue living as if I don't know anything. Continue to live a pathetic lie. I could not. Anyway, what about Mike? He knew something, that's for sure. But it seemed like he was on the wrong end of the stick. Of course, I will see my son Mike in a different light from then on. But will I love Linda and Tom any less? I couldn't imagine what I would be. How could I? They were my children, and no piece of paper could change that. What about Hilly? That was the question. What about this bitch? And my damn brother, for that matter. And Pam, my sister in misfortune. What's wrong with her? How will she take the news? How will the rest of the family take the news? Too many questions were spinning in my head. Oh God, this was all so difficult, and I didn't feel ready for the challenge. I remember walking out the front door and starting to walk down the street, but the next thing I remember was waking up in the hospital with bandages on my arms. I fell under a car while completely drunk, but I didn't know it at the time. Davy, are you okay? I looked back to see who asked the question, but it hurt. It hurts like hell. It dawned on me and I realized that it was my ex-wife talking to me. No, not yet anyway. She was still my wife. I didn't say anything, at least nothing significant. I just didn't know what to say. What about, "Hi, honey. I just found out that the two kids aren't mine and that you cheated on me with my brother. Did you have a good day? What's for dinner?" Doesn't sound quite right, does it? In any case, it turned out that my injuries were far from life-threatening, and I was sent home the next day. However, there was nothing I could do to help myself, so I stalled while I had to rely on Hilly for help. It gave me time to think, time to plan. However, time was wasted, and I still didn't know what to do. But somehow Mike and the other two kids seemed to be the main problem. Whatever I decided had to be in their best interests, even if my interests were to suffer. From now on, Hilly's interests will come last. All I knew was that our 20th wedding anniversary was approaching, and the room was booked for a big dinner. By this time, everything should be settled. Within a week or so, I was more or less back to normal, at least physically, and everything seemed to go back to normal while I wondered what to do, except for Mike, who seemed to be in danger of going off the rails and was just the right age to do so. "You'll have to talk to him, Davy," Hilly said late one evening. "I don't know what's wrong with him. It seems he doesn't want to talk to me anymore." "I'll talk to him," I promised. "Any idea what's wrong with him?" she asked. "Eat. Some," I answered briefly. "Do you want to discuss them with me, Davy?" "Not really," I replied, which somewhat discouraged her. The opportunity presented itself the next day when I found him alone in his room, and unless he pushed me out of the way, he would not be able to avoid me. "Do you want to talk about what's bothering you, son?" I began softly. He just shook his head, didn't want to talk. "Maybe it has something to do with that day, Mike." I nudged him. "Oh, well, about our relationship." Mike looked at me and I couldn't help but notice the tear in his eye. Suddenly, he began to look older than his tender years. "You don't know Dad, do you?" He challenged me. "I may know more than you think, son," I answered him, trying to keep a smile on my face. "Then why don't you do something about it, Dad?" he whined. "Why do you let them get away with everything? Wait! Things weren't going the way I thought. It's not like we're talking about the same thing." "Get away with what, son?" "What the hell else could I say?" "You really don't know, Dad," he repeated. "Apparently not, son," I was forced to admit. "This is Mom and Uncle Tim, Dad," he told me, in no more than a whisper. "When you're at work, once a month or so, this is fucking embarrassing." Uncle Tim. Blimey. Tim was the husband of Anne, another one of Hilly's damn sisters. "Oh, that," I muttered pathetically, not knowing what else to say. "They've been doing this for years, Dad," my son told me. "Linda thinks I'm Tim's son, not yours." At this point, he broke down and cried, and I wrapped my arms around him to comfort him. It had been a long time since I had done this, and I was surprised at how big and strong my little boy felt. "I can absolutely guarantee you, Mike," I consoled him, continuing to hug him. "You are my son in every way, not Tim's." "How do you know, Dad?" He sobbed. "How can you be sure?" "I'm sure, son," I told him firmly. "Believe me, I'm sure." We chatted for a while, and, without giving too much away, I convinced him of fatherhood, and it was like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. However, there was no mention of my brother being the father of 2 other children, and I discovered that my ideal family was not as happy and content as I had believed. Both Linda and Tom knew about their mother's affair with their uncle, but, not knowing what to do about it, they chose to simply turn a blind eye to it. What a terrible situation you can put your own children in. But Tim? Lord. His wife Anne was the youngest of 4 sisters, and, without a doubt, the most beautiful of them all. Hilly was attractive enough, but Anne? Another blow was struck to the heart of my so-called perfect marriage with Hilly. A few days later, I took all 3 kids to dinner and did the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I told them. I told them everything I found out. Damn it all. I had no idea how they would react, but they took it well. Linda cried a little, and Tom sat with his heat in his hands. All 3 of them wanted to go and meet their mother right away, but I convinced them to wait, as I had some business to take care of first. All 3 of them swore their love and devotion to me, and were close to refusing to ever see Hilly again. I, of course, talked them out of it, reminding them that no matter what she did, she was still their mother and took excellent care of them all their lives. I talked about her in terms I didn't really feel, especially when the children told me their story. Hilly, my loving wife, apparently had a relationship with her brother-in-law Tim for some time, but probably not really long enough to be Mike's father. Once a month might also be a big exaggeration, but to be honest, none of us knew that. The only thing I knew was that the children were so grateful to be told all this, and all 3 of them cried, and even Tom when we gathered together at the end of the evening. I'll correct the last statement. All 4 of us were crying. I needed to get revenge, but in a way that wouldn't cause grief to my children. And yes, I use that term with caution. I mean my children. I thought for a long time, but could not come up with any spectacular act of revenge. It should have just been a direct confrontation. At least I had an event where I could do it. The family gathered, as a family should. My parents by that time had already died, and Bob and I were quite late children. That evening at the celebratory dinner, there were 39 of us, mostly members of the Hilly family and their families, but there were also other friends of ours. Dinner was good. At least that's what they told me, and as for me, I could eat cardboard and drink water. Time for speeches. Began. End? Maybe it's a start. I was sweating profusely and taking long, deep breaths to calm myself. What I had to do was not easy, but it had to be done. We welcome all our family and friends, I began, and for a few moments continued talking about unimportant things. Now, let's celebrate 20 years of marriage to my wife, Hilly. I finally finished. There are some very interesting, even intimate and personal things about my marriage to my dear wife that I want to tell you all about. There was some giggling around the large table and one or two rude comments about our supposed sex life. Hilly blushed. They all thought I was joking, but how wrong they were. When the laughter died down, first Linda stood up from her seat and headed out of the dining room, followed by Tom and then Mike. They didn't say a word to anyone, and the whole table watched their backs in amazement, not understanding what was happening. "You three, come back here," Hilly shouted angrily, jumping to her feet. "Don't be so rude to your father." Only Tom responded, turning to look at his mother for a moment and shaking his head in displeasure before joining his brother and sister outside. "Davy," my wife shouted to me, "do something! Tell them to come back immediately." "It's okay, honey," I told her very firmly. "They already know what I'm going to say, and since it concerns the three of them, maybe it would be better if they weren't here." Hilly's mouth opened in surprise. First out of surprise at how I responded to her demand, and then out of concern, as her mind must have been running through all the possible reasons for my behavior. "Sit down, Hilly," I told her, my tone leaving no doubt that I was not to be trifled with. "As I said," I continued, looking at the people around me, "I had 20 wonderful years of marriage, a perfect marriage, or so I thought until a couple of weeks ago." I paused for effect, and the atmosphere around the table became electric. Some looked puzzled, others were still smiling, expecting a joke, but some of them were very worried, including a few people that surprised me. Imagine my surprise, I continued when no one said anything, to find out that Linda, my beloved Linda, is not actually my own daughter. "Oh my God," Hilly sobbed quietly, covering her face with her hands, the only one who made a sound. "Would you like to tell everyone who Linda's real father is, Hilly?" I asked her, but she was silent, only sobbing loudly, the only sound that broke the complete silence around me. "Okay then," I continued. "Anyone else want to tell everyone who Linda's father is? Anyone else want to tell everyone who had sex with my wife behind my back?" No one spoke, and I just stood there, glaring at the family and friends around me. As terrible as it was, in some strange way, I took a strange pleasure in teasing the people who were deceiving me. None of them knew how much I had found out. I couldn't help but give my brother Bob a particularly stern look, and he visibly sank under my gaze, realizing that the game was over. "So no one is going to confess?" I asked them. "Do I have to tell everyone who it is?" Then I was surprised, and it was a surprise when Bob's wife, Pam, jumped to her feet. "It's not what you think, Davy," she screamed in suffering. "It wasn't a dirty affair or anything like that. It was just sex a few times to get Hilly pregnant. The whole family was desperate for a boy, especially the mother, and you seemed incapable of fathering a child. Fortunately, at that moment, no one hit me with the proverbial feather. Otherwise, I would definitely have been knocked down. She knew. She knew damn well. Pam knew that her husband, my brother, was the father of my daughter. I looked around the table and saw that it was divided into two camps, friends who didn't know and family who mostly seemed to know. While I stood and tried to come to my senses, my friends, one after another, stood up, made excuses, and embarrassedly left, leaving 17 or 18 of us, all family members. "Go play over there," said Julie, one of Hilly's sisters, and one by one, the younger children were led out of the way. The teenagers were also told to disappear, but it was like EastEnders. Coronation Street and Neighbors rolled into one, and none of them budgeted. Fair. You knew damn well, didn't you? I exclaimed, looking around. You all know about this damn fiasco, except maybe the children. A couple of the husbands looked a little confused, but otherwise no one denied it. Listen, Davy, said my brother. It's not what it seems, to be honest. He wanted to add another stupid comment, but my look of hatred silenced him. So you all knew that Bob had sex with my loving wife and was Linda's father? I demanded from those sitting at the table. No one said yes, but then again, no one denied it. It only happened 3 times, Davy, Pam said again. Enough to get her pregnant. Whose damn idea was this? I shouted out loud to them, my temper starting to flare up. Again, no one said anything, but there were simply too many glances directed at Jen, my mother-in-law. I could have guessed. Thank you, Mom, I solemnly told her. Your desperate desire to have a son in the family cost me my marriage. No, Hilly cried, finally deciding to take part. Please don't say that, Davy. You can't say that. I couldn't live without you. Of coursey, you can only forgive me for one mistake. One mistake? I asked her. Just one mistake? Of course, honey, Hilly sobbed. It was just one time. It seems terrible now, but when Mom planned it all years ago, it all seemed logical. What about Tom, then? Well, of course he's yours, Davy, she whined. What do you mean? Wrong, I told her. I did a DNA test, and his father is the same man as Linda's father. The atmosphere at the table immediately changed. What are you saying, Davy? Pam exclaimed in surprise. You heard me, Pam, I told her. If my ever-loving brother is Linda's father, then he is also Tom's father. Silence. This information was obviously new to everyone at the table, or at least to most of them. You're a bastard, Bob, Pam said to her husband, as realization dawned. You promised me, and then you went back to have fun with that bitch? Bob simply lowered his head, wishing he was somewhere else. And you, bitch, Pam yelled at Hilly. I agreed to let you have my husband for just 1 week, and you decided that he is now yours? With these words, she took 3 steps towards her sister and hit Hilly in the face with all her might. She scolded Hilly, hitting her again and again, only stopping and bursting into tears when one of the others pulled her away from her little sister. Happy mom, huh? I spat at Jen, but all she did was stare at me into space. So who else was entertaining my wife behind my back? I asked when no one else spoke, looking straight at Tim, who was sitting on the other side of the table from me. You bastard, Julie shouted next to me. This got me hooked, too. So it's true what they told me that night, isn't it, bastard? You actually had sex with her that night at the party. Tim wasn't even a very good liar or very clever that evening, failing to dodge his wife Anne's fist when she punched him in the nose. Don't come back to our house tonight, Anne shouted at her husband. And in general, never come back. That goes for you too, Pam told Bob. I'm divorcing you and I never want to see you again. The 3 offended sisters held hands and headed towards the door. You are not our sister, they shouted in Hilly's face, breaking free. Are you happy now, Jen? I asked my mother-in-law, but the expression on her face did not change. She sat and looked straight ahead, and Hilly continued to sob in her arms. Sorry, Davy, Alf, my father-in-law, finally intervened. If I knew... He paused, lost for words, but he was the only one of these bastards who made any effort to apologize. Then Brother Bob walked around the table and came to me, holding out his hands, with an expression of extreme shame on his face. Davy, he coughed. Davy, what can I say? Nothing, bastard, I spat in response, and without much force I swung at him and hit my brother right in the chin. The force might not be great, but the timing was perfect, and he stumbled backwards, tripping over a chair and sprawling on the floor, and was in no hurry to get up. I guess you could say that, at this point, the party broke up. The fun seemed to have gone out the whole evening. That evening, Hilly never returned home, and in fact, other than to pick up a few things, she never came home again. The children refused to talk to her for some time after that, but no matter how much I hated her, I had to think about the long-term well-being of the children. Eventually, they came to their senses and accepted her back into their lives, but not in the same way as before. I was the dad, and well, I think she became more like a favorite aunt. The whole family fell apart. Two of the three sisters who left that night got divorced, and only Pam remained with Bob. Although she gave him a hell of a dressing down, deciding that what was good for the goose was good for the goose. Pam came over a couple of evenings later when the kids were out, and it quickly became clear what was on her mind. Whether it was revenge for her or a desire to take revenge on me, I never knew. But I received payback. There was no love, no compassion, and we just had revenge sex for hours. It was weird, just like sex with my wife, but different. After that, she thanked me and left, and I only found out a few months later that she had become a habit, slowly going through Bob's friends until she had slept with almost all of them. Will their marriage survive? I don't know, and I didn't care. Not my problem, but I must feel damn sorry for that damn brother. 3 weeks later, one of the sisters, Anne, who was pretty, called me and invited me to dinner. I went, we ate, talked, romanticized, kissed, and ended up in bed. But this time, everything was different, and after the initial passions, we made love, and it was again like my early days with Hilly. I don't know why Tim neglected his marriage, but it certainly had nothing to do with Anne's sexual appetite. The sweetest pill, perhaps, was when Alf, the long-suffering husband of my ex-mother-in-law Jen, decided that he had had enough of her interference, bought a 12-meter yacht, and spent the rest of his active life sailing around Europe. I, and sometimes the children, spent a week or two sailing with him, and places like the south of France, La Rochelle, and the Canaries became familiar to us. Linda married a young Spaniard whom she met while sailing, and whose family owned, perhaps, the largest yacht marina in Europe. This came in handy, too. The two boys are still playing on the field, perhaps being warned against marrying too early. As their father did. They had time. And I? I don't see Hilly, but the children tell me that she lives day by day and often asks about me. The kids tell me, but I just grumble. Oh, and I'm thinking about trying my hand at the perfect marriage again. But this time, with Anne. I think we love each other, but we're both still a little wary. Let's see. I want to make sure I don't marry Anne just to spite Hilly, but I'd like to see her face if I did.